You're listening to Owning the Buy Box, an IP Secure podcast. This is the podcast for agencies, brands, and aggregators who want to master Amazon, push out unauthorized competition, and take their business to the next level. You're about to hear a conversation that'll help you maximize your growth on Amazon by owning the Buy Box. Let's get into the show.
Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Owning the Buy Box. I'm your host, Dave Cooper. I'm also the CEO and founder of IP Secure. We're doing a slightly different episode today. Over the last year or so, as we've done lots of episodes of the show and talked to brand owners and talked to solution providers and talked to exclusive sellers about the challenges of brand protection and its importance to the bottom line of the business and to their e-commerce revenue. We get a lot of different questions. We get suggestions for topics. Recently, a couple of different individuals reached out and said maybe we should talk a little bit about some of the new legislation that's coming. There are some U.S. laws that have been enacted that are going into effect fairly soon, and they will definitely impact the marketplace ecosystem, marketplaces in the United States in general, and definitely probably have an impact on your brand protection program and how you deal with unauthorized sellers, what that might mean for your program. So rather than have a guest on, we thought instead we would do a breakdown, a layman's terms, simplified approach to what does this actually really mean for me, if anything, and do I need to make any changes to my program or my approach in how I try to minimize unauthorized sellers and brand abuse and lost sales? So the legislation is called the Informed Consumers Act, and it's been bouncing around Congress for quite a while. Key provisions of it were included in the appropriations bill, which was passed at the end of last year. And it's called the Informed Consumers Act, and it stands for Integrity, Notification, and Fairness in Online Retail Marketplaces for Consumers Act. It's quite a mouthful, that's for sure. And I think the specific elements that have been taken from it and included are certainly well-meaning, and I think the intention is certainly a good one. When you go through the actual language that's in there, I think clearly it's really about creating a more transparent environment for the consumer. Tell me who I'm buying from. At its most simplistic, I think that's the intent. And they achieve it through a variety of different types of disclosures and data collection policies that marketplaces have to follow. So it'll be interesting to see, how, of course, it gets implemented. I think the devil's in the details, and that may be a kind of a reoccurring theme of today's episode, because again, I think intent is one thing, and then implementation, of course, is another, and it will certainly be the deciding factor as to whether or not this leads to, less unauthorized seller activity, less counterfeit products for sale. There isn't a lot of time. Marketplaces in particular have really until June. You have a matter of a few months at this point to prepare for what's coming. And there are real consequences if you are not prepared. I think a lot of the larger platforms, of course, probably Amazon in particular, started last year, right, enforcing not only outside the U.S. but here domestically the requirement for sellers to begin publishing some contact data on their profile. That's already been happening. So I think the bigger marketplaces are certainly going to be fine and do quite well. There's not a lot of time either. This legislation is geared towards really things that marketplaces have to do. And that's going to be starting very soon here in a matter of months. So it does take effect on June 27th. I would assume that marketplaces are already preparing for this, and some of the elements that are included in here, if they're not already doing it, there are, in our perspective, some things here that are already happening, and it's helpful to have them in there, but we don't expect them to have a real material effect on the landscape going forward. There are consequences if you are not compliant, and those are over $46,000 per violation. So again, for a mid-sized marketplace platform operating in the United States, that's of course significant money. It is for anyone, I think, for that matter, when there are such massive volumes of sellers and data, and layered on top a set of complex requirements that are going to be costly to implement and remain compliant with, and require real resources to implement correctly. So that's the sort of maximum monetary penalty that could be applied, and there are a variety of different ways that it could be enforced. So it's something that marketplaces are going to need to really make sure they're compliant with. It wouldn't surprise me if, there are quite a few that are ahead of the curve, quite frankly. And it starts with the collection of data. It's quite interesting, actually, because in the marketplace space, from a brand protection standpoint, they're sort of the neutral party in the discussion, right, historically. And so now there's an emphasis on them to collect certain pieces of information from the merchants and the sellers that are operating on their platforms. And I think while, again, a lot of this has been happening already from just a practical standpoint, you're doing business with that seller on your platform, it's the first time ever that it's now become so explicit from a U.S. legislative perspective, something that you simply can't ignore going forward. So from a data collection standpoint, which is sort of like the first step in the process, or sort of phase one, if you will, the minimum threshold a seller must meet are 200 transactions or $5,000 a year in gross sales. That triggers the requirements for the marketplace to collect information about the seller. And seems fairly obvious and intuitive to me. I think it's insinuated that this data should be accurate when it's provided. Things like a government issued ID, seller's name, a bank account number, maybe, a tax ID, and a working email and phone. How you would validate, all this information, I think, is not something that is rendered explicit, but I would imagine that it's going to be quite difficult, right? You can imagine that marketplaces have hundreds or thousands of sellers that they would be trying to vet that's because the $5,000 level, I think, is fairly low. You know, the group will get smaller as that limit increases, and you'll see that in the next kind of phase of the regulations. But $5,000 a year is a pretty low bar, and so now you're required to provide this information to the marketplace. They're required to collect it. That's it. That's the requirement, is to collect this data. I'm also not aware of any explicit requirement that, for instance, you know, the tax ID and, you know, the bank account number have to be matching. I would assume that, but I haven't seen anything that renders that explicit. So we have this collection requirement. A lot of that data is getting collected already. If not, it soon will be, and it will apply to sellers, only sellers generating over $5,000 a year in revenue on that particular platform.
You already know your success relies on your Amazon sales growth, and that means beating counterfeiters and illicit sellers to the buy box. But do you have all the tools you need to do so effectively? IP Secure offers seller intelligence to understand and root out unauthorized sellers and push them out of the buy box through simple enforcement actions that actually work, meaning customers will only see your legitimate products and shop from your authorized sellers. Learn how at ipsecure.com.
The documents need to get verified by the marketplace. So there is a verification process, as I just talked about. So that's going to, I think, raise lots of questions. Who's receiving the documents? Are they able and qualified and have access to the right tools or training to validate those documents? Throughout our episodes, as we've talked about different techniques that unauthorized sellers use, one that we've heard on a fairly consistent basis is the usage of forged documents in an effort to circumvent certain policies or perhaps represent their product as legitimately acquired when it was not. So again, devil's in the details here. The marketplace is required to do this verification, but how it's implemented and by whom is, I think, the big question mark. They do have to do it every year. And so I think a couple things. One is that may in and of itself create some sort of deterrent, although a year is a fairly long amount of time. And you know, a lot of the unauthorized sellers that we see, they show up, they offload as much product as they can in a short period of time, and they disappear. So they don't really necessarily probably have a lot of concern about making it through that second verification process. That assumes the marketplace is sort of doing the minimum here, right? Which is verifying that information on an annual basis. I just have to get through it once, right? I just have to get through it once. I've now got 12 months before that verification process might happen again. But it is better than no requirement for ongoing verification at all. But again, leaves pretty wide gaps in there based on the behavior we know is exhibited by a lot of counterfeit and unauthorized sellers. Marketplaces also have to implement certain things. Namely, they are very specific in the legislation about, you know, additional data security measures. And it's not about really protecting the consumer or your brand, right? For that matter, it's specific about seller information. And so I think part of it is about collecting this data, and then, you know, in the next phase, you'll hear more about disclosing the data when it's appropriate to disclose that data. So as a seller, your privacy is more important the less economically successful you are based on this legislation. The more economically successful you are, the more transparent you need to be with your data So it's, I think this is a sort of token nod to, we want you to do all these disclosure and data collection things, but we still want you to remember that you have to respect the privacy of the people who sell on your platform. So those things to me just inherently seem in conflict. The last part, which I did mention briefly, the disclosure part. So it starts with collection at $5,000 a year in sales. Once you, or if you, as a brand, as a seller, achieve $20,000 in revenue, then these additional requirements kick in to not only collect the data, but disclose certain parts of that data. And this is not really intended to aid in brand protection efforts whatsoever. This is almost exclusively intended, again, to help consumers make informed decisions about who they're actually purchasing that product from, which today seems to be getting sort of more and more difficult as buying online becomes easier. So things like name and address and email and phone, it all makes sense. The one part that we found to be unique and interesting and different is this aspect of the commingling, which is something that we all know goes on within, Amazon's supply chain, within other large marketplace supply chains. So this is a sort of interesting way, I think, to try to give a little bit more transparency to that consumer by having to declare if the product is being commingled. So did I buy it from seller A, but actually I got a product supplied by seller B? So this is a quite common practice, and so it will be interesting to see. I do think there's a sort of ancillary brand protection benefit to this as well, especially if test purchases are a big part of your program, and having the clarity for some chain of custody and understanding of exactly who touched that product on its way to its destination. So sellers that don't comply, provide the information within 10 days of being requested, should be suspended or must be suspended. I don't know if that's 10 days from when they receive the request or from when the date of the request, which conceivably is the day it was requested, not necessarily when it was received or viewed. 10 days is not a huge amount of time. I would hope that marketplaces might take a little bit more controlled approach to this. But again, most major platforms, obviously Amazon being the biggest one, sellers are already managing their data on that platform. They have access, right, to the systems and the tools to very quickly go in and manage their information. And I'm quite confident that the implementation of this, again, for the larger platforms is not going to be terribly difficult. Most of the data is being collected already. I think it's the verification part. That's where additional resource and technology is probably going to be needed by these various marketplace platforms, because it's going to be quite an endeavor to remain compliant. It doesn't say, verify only a percentage or collect the data of only a percentage of sellers over 5K. It says all of the sellers over 5K. So the pool could be, quite large. Outside of data collection and disclosure, they also need to provide some sort of consumer reporting mechanism. And this only applies to the high volume sellers, which we defined as over that $20,000 a year threshold. But there must be some sort of reporting mechanism on the listing itself to report, quote unquote, abuse. Again, most major platforms have this. Amazon has this. This is not something that I think is novel or new or different. Smaller, medium-sized marketplaces, they may need to institute something that's a little bit more specific and real time and direct. But to us, this appeared to be kind of a redundant thing that was already happening. Some of the carve-outs and exceptions, and there are quite a few that kind of jumped out at us and some of the folks that we collected feedback from for today's show. And the disclosure part, which is the part that really is meant, right, to impact the consumer's purchasing experience and minimize their exposure to counterfeit products, it only applies if you're over that $20,000 threshold. So there are concerns that if your ability to spin up seller accounts is not dramatically tightened, then you could have multiple accounts running. You could stay below that threshold. You could find a way around this. So the devil's in the details, like we said. If the other key provisions of this are instituted in full, then it really shouldn't be that hard to disclose the information relative to the sellers that are above that mark, but it leaves quite a few out. It leaves a lot of people out, a lot of sellers out. If you don't have a bank account, then that just doesn't apply, which we found quite interesting. I don't know if you need to check a box and attest under the penalty of perjury that you don't have a bank account. I guess there are other forms of electronic payment that you could use in lieu of a bank account, but this one seems sort of interesting, but it remains to be seen if it'll be abused. But it is a carve-out. I mean, if all I have to do is say I don't have a bank account and I don't have to actually provide one, then that definitely leaves a serious gap in the marketplace's ability to confirm and verify who I am. We see this a lot on the show and a lot when we help deal with unauthorized sellers online. Many of them operate from their homes, from residencies. So this particular carve-out, which I can understand, a lot of people do operate businesses from home, especially on marketplaces where they're selling craft goods and things like that. But even more generally, a lot of people, have home-based businesses and can be quite successful doing that. The problem is so do counterfeiters and unauthorized sellers. So this is a tough one to solve. I think it would have been more appropriate to have, and probably more effective, to have some requirements around where the seller is sourcing that particular product. But I realize that may be a bridge a little too far at the moment. And that would, again, just put more complexity in the lap of the marketplace. But enabling home-based businesses to simply sort of opt out of the disclosure requirements around address and phone, to me, definitely looks like it could be and would be abused by counterfeiters and unauthorized sellers. The marketplace has that messaging capability, and I think the intent here of the legislation was not that message goes to a customer service representative who works for the marketplace, but they want a direct line of communication for the buyer and for the seller. And let's assume that exists. Then the phone and email requirement doesn't apply, which again is sort of fascinating, because I think the person communicating with you through this two-way channel may or may not be the same entity that's creating, the marketplace listings and the offers and the products, i.e. engaging the consumer on what they're actually buying. So this again just seems like a disconnect. And is there going to be some sort of technical evaluation about what constitutes an acceptable, buyer-seller messaging capability? I think it's too vague, and I think it's going to be open for various interpretations. And that, of course, is not the most helpful thing when the problem we're dealing with is a fairly severe one. And I think this was an opportunity to get some real teeth, and we only got, a tooth. And I think that's a shame in some regard, because what people really need are additional legislative tools and identifying the behavior, whether that's the sale of counterfeits, it's the violation of contractual rights, it's the sale of stolen goods. These are all use cases that are significant in the marketplace universe and ecosystem. This was a missed opportunity to give some real good tools to brands to fight back. So the end result and our conclusion is maybe this helps. We're all for additional tools in the toolbox, but in many ways, there's just too many gaps to really rely on this having a significant impact or lasting change in the flow of unauthorized sellers, in the flow of counterfeit product online. Actually, it's not even intended for that purpose. Nowhere does the legislation create additional rights for brand owners, or a new way that you can enforce your IP rights or your current reseller contracts. Nothing in this legislation points to anything remotely like that. The entire intent of it is really for consumers. So in that regard, it's great. I mean, I'm all for a more transparent buying experience as a consumer myself. But from a brand protection perspective, from an IP protection perspective, this does not do a whole lot, and it's not intended to. So that's important to understand right up front. There are some good benefits, and I think we'll call them indirect benefits, because as I said, that's not really the intent of any of this. But creating seller accounts could definitely become harder. If the policies are instituted, I think, in a fairly robust way, and the verification is instituted in a fairly robust way, then of course this is going to make it more difficult for counterfeit sellers to spin up new seller accounts. And that's, I think, an important step forward. I think if that's happening, then the reliability of the data, I think, increases. So things like test buys become, I think, a little more valuable in terms of your data collection, and the reliability of the data that you are collecting. So there are real benefits to this, and I think it's great that it's been included, but it's not the silver bullet you need, and it's not going to, I think, significantly require you to change your brand protection program. You got to stay vigilant. That's really what it comes down to. And hopefully, as a brand owner, as an exclusive seller, you're already doing that. As an exclusive licensee, you're already doing that, right? Every hour that you don't own the buy box, you're losing revenue, and you're losing it to someone else. And vigilance is really at the heartbeat of how you solve that particular problem. Well, I hope this has been helpful. Again, this is just our basic layman's terms approach to understanding the Informed Consumers Act. My name's Dave Cooper. I'm your host. This is Owning the Buy Box. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, everywhere your favorite podcasts are airing. You can also reach out to me directly on LinkedIn if you'd like anytime. We'd love ideas for the show, questions or comments. Thanks so much. Have a wonderful day.
You've been listening to Owning the Buy Box, a show from IP Secure. Never miss an episode by subscribing to the show in your favorite podcast player. Please give us a rating, leave a comment, and share episodes that you love. That helps us keep delivering you the tools you need to sharpen your competitive edge and ensure your authorized sellers always own the buy box. We'll see you next time.